Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor, was King of the United Kingdom and the Dominions of the British Empire and Emperor of India from January 20, 1936 until his abdication in December of the same year. Edward was born during the reign of his great-grandmother Queen Victoria as the eldest child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V and Queen Mary. He was created Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday, 7 weeks after his father succeeded as king. As a young man, Edward served in the British Army during the First World War and undertook several overseas tours on behalf of his father. While Prince of Wales, he engaged in a series of sexual affairs that worried both his father and then British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Upon his father's death in 1936, Edward became the second monarch of the House of Windsor. The new king showed impatience with court protocol, and caused concern among politicians by his apparent disregard for established constitutional conventions. Only months into his reign, a constitutional crisis was caused by his proposal to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was seeking a divorce from her second. The prime ministers of the United Kingdom and the Dominions opposed the marriage, arguing a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands was politically and socially unacceptable as a prospective queen consort. Additionally, such a marriage would have conflicted with Edward's status as titular head of the Church of England, which, at the time, disapproved of remarriage after divorce if a former spouse was still alive. Edward knew the Baldwin government would resign if the marriage went ahead, which could have forced a general election and would have ruined his status as a politically neutral constitutional monarch. When it became apparent he could not marry Simpson and remain on the throne, he abdicated. He was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI. With a reign of 326 days, Edward was one of the shortest reigning British monarchs to date. After his abdication, Edward was created Duke of Windsor. He married Simpson in France on June 3, 1937, after her second divorce became final. Later that year, the couple toured Nazi Germany, which fed rumors that he was a Nazi sympathizer. During the Second World War, Edward was at first stationed with the British military mission to France, but after the fall of France was appointed governor of the Bahamas. After the war, Edward spent the rest of his life in France. He and Wallis remained married until his death in 1972, they had no children. Early life. An only child, Bessie Wallis Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in Square Cottage at Monterey Inn, a hotel directly across the road from the Monterey Country Club, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. A summer resort close to the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, Blue Ridge Summit was popular with Baltimoreans escaping the season's heat, and Monterey Inn, which had a central building, as well as individual wooden cottages, was the town's largest hotel. Her father was Teacle Wallis Warfield, the fifth and youngest son of Henry McTeer Warfield, a flour merchant, described as one of the best known and personally one of the most popular citizens of Baltimore, who ran for mayor in 1875. Her mother was Alice Montague, a daughter of stockbroker William Lawtane Montague. Wallis was named in honor of her father and her mother's elder sister, Bessie, and was called Bessie Wallis until, at some time in her youth, the name Bessie was dropped. According to a wedding announcement in the Baltimore Sun, her parents were married by C. Ernest Smith at Baltimore's St. Michael and All Angels Protestant Episcopal Church on November 19, 1895, which suggests she was conceived out of wedlock. Wallis claimed that her parents were married in June 1895. Her father died of tuberculosis on November 15, 1896. For her first few years, she and her mother were dependent upon the charity of her father's wealthy bachelor brother Solomon Davies Warfield, postmaster of Baltimore and later president of the Continental Trust Company and the Seaboard Air Line Railway. Initially, they lived with him at the 4-story row house, 34 East Preston Street that he shared with his mother. In 1901, Wallis's Aunt Bessie Merriman was widowed, and the following year Alice and Wallis moved into her four-bedroom house on West Chase Street, Baltimore, where they lived for at least a year until they settled in an apartment, and then a house, of their own. In 1908, Wallis's mother married her second husband, John Freeman Raisin, son of prominent Democratic Party boss Isaac Freeman Raisin. On April 17, 1910, Wallis was confirmed at Christ Episcopal Church, Baltimore, and between 1912 and 1914 her uncle paid for her to attend Oldfields School, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland. There she became a friend of heiress Renée DuPont, a daughter of Senator T. Coleman DuPont of the DuPont family, and Mary Kirk, whose family founded Kirk Silverware. A fellow pupil at one of Wallis's schools recalled, "She was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did." Wallis was always immaculately dressed and pushed herself hard to do well. A later biographer wrote of her, though Wallis's jaw was too heavy for her to be counted beautiful, her fine violet blue eyes and petite figure, quick wits, vitality, and capacity for total concentration on her interlocutor ensured that she had many admirers. First marriage. In April 1916, Wallis met Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a U.S. Navy aviator, in Pensacola, Florida, while visiting her cousin Corinne Muston. It was at this time that Wallis witnessed two airplane crashes about 2 weeks apart, resulting in a lifelong fear of flying. The couple married on November 8, 1916, at Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore, which had been Wallis's parish. Win, as her husband was known, was a heavy drinker. He drank even before flying and once crashed into the sea, but escaped almost unharmed. After the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Spencer was posted to San Diego as the first commanding officer of a training base in Coronado, known as Naval Air Station North Island. They remained there until 1921. In 1920, Edward, the Prince of Wales, visited San Diego, but he and Wallis did not meet. Later that year, Spencer left his wife for a period of 4 months, but in the spring of 1921 they were reunited in Washington, D.C., where Spencer had been posted. They soon separated again, and in 1922, when Spencer was posted to the Far East as commander of the USS Pampanga, Wallis remained behind, continuing an affair with an Argentine diplomat, Felipe de Espal. In January 1924, she visited Paris with her recently widowed cousin Corinne Muston, before sailing to the Far East aboard a troop carrier, USS Chaumont. The Spencers were briefly reunited until she fell ill, after which she returned to Hong Kong. Wallis toured China, and while in Beijing stayed with Catherine and Herman Rogers, who were to remain her long-term friends. According to the wife of one of Win's fellow officers, Mrs. Milton E. Miles, in Beijing Wallis met Count Galeazzo Chano, later Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, had an affair with him, and became pregnant, leading to a botched abortion that left her infertile. The rumor was later widespread but never substantiated, and Chano's wife, Etta Mussolini, denied it. The existence of an official China dossier is denied by historians and biographers. Wallis spent over a year in China, during which time, according to the socialite Madame Wellington Koo, she managed to master only one Chinese phrase: "Boy, pass me the champagne." By September 1925, she and her husband were back in the United States, though living apart. Their divorce was finalized on December 10, 1927. Second marriage. By the time her marriage to Spencer was dissolved, Wallis had become involved with Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an Anglo-American shipping executive and former officer in the Coldstream Guards. He divorced his first wife, Dorothea, to marry Wallis on July 21, 1928, at the Register Office in Chelsea, London. Wallis had telegraphed her acceptance of his proposal from Caen, where she was staying with her friends, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. The Simpsons temporarily set up home in a furnished house with 4 servants in Mayfair. In 1929, Wallis sailed back to the United States to visit her sick mother, who had married legal clerk Charles Gordon Allen after the death of Raisin. During the trip, Wallis's investments were wiped out in the Wall Street crash, and her mother died penniless on November 2, 1929. Wallis returned to England, and with the shipping business still buoyant, the Simpsons moved into a large flat with a staff of servants. Through a friend, Consuelo Thaw, Wallis met Consuelo's sister Thelma, Lady Furness, at the time the mistress of Edward, Prince of Wales. On January 10, 1931, Lady Furness introduced Wallis to the prince at Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray. The prince was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary, an heir apparent to the British throne. Between 1931 and 1934, he met the Simpsons at various house parties, and Wallis was presented at court. Ernest was beginning to encounter financial difficulties, as the Simpsons were living beyond their means, and they had to fire a succession of staff. Relationship with Edward, Prince of Wales. In January 1934, while Lady Furness was away in New York City, Wallis allegedly became the prince's mistress. Edward denied this to his father, despite his staff seeing them in bed together as well as evidence of a physical sexual act. Wallis soon ousted Lady Furness, and the prince distanced himself from a former lover and confidant, the Anglo-American textile heiress Freda Dudley Ward. By the end of 1934, Edward was irretrievably besotted with Wallis, finding her domineering manner and abrasive irreverence toward his position appealing. In the words of his official biographer, he became slavishly dependent on her. According to Wallis, it was during a cruise on Lord Moyne's private yacht Rosaura in August 1934 that she fell in love with Edward. At an evening party in Buckingham Palace, he introduced her to his mother. His father was outraged, primarily on account of her marital history, as divorced people were generally excluded from court. Edward showered Wallis with money and jewels, and in February 1935, and again later in the year, he holidayed with her in Europe. His courtiers became increasingly alarmed as the affair began to interfere with his official duties. In 1935, the head of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch told the Metropolitan Police Commissioner that Wallis was also having an affair with Guy Marcus Trundle, who was said to be employed by the Ford Motor Company. Claims of an affair were doubted, however, by Captain Val Bailey, who knew Trundle well and whose mother had an affair with Trundle for nearly 2 decades, and by historian Susan Williams. Abdication crisis. On January 20, 1936, George V died at Sandringham and Edward ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. The next day, he broke royal protocol by watching the proclamation of his accession from a window of St. James's Palace, in the company of the still married Wallis. It was becoming apparent to court and government circles that the new king-emperor meant to marry her. The king's behavior and his relationship with Wallis made him unpopular with the conservative-led British government, as well as distressing his mother and his brother the Duke of York. The British media remained deferential to the monarchy, and no stories of the affair were reported in the domestic press, but foreign media widely reported their relationship. After the death of George V, before her divorce from her second husband, Wallis reportedly said, "Soon I shall be Queen of England." The monarch of the United Kingdom is Supreme Governor of the Church of England. At the time of the proposed marriage, the Church of England disapproved of, and would not perform, the remarriage of divorced people if their former spouse was still alive. Constitutionally, the king was required to be in communion with the Church of England, but his proposed marriage conflicted with the Church's teachings. Additionally, at the time both the Church and English law only recognized adultery as a legitimate ground for divorce. Since she had divorced her first husband on grounds of mutual incompatibility, there was a possibility that her second marriage, as well as her prospective marriage to Edward, would be considered bigamous if her first divorce had been challenged in court. The British and Dominion governments believed that a twice-divorced woman was politically, socially, and morally unsuitable as a prospective consort. She was perceived by many in the British Empire as a woman of limitless ambition who was pursuing the king because of his wealth and position. Wallis had already filed for divorce from her second husband on the grounds that he had committed adultery with her childhood friend Mary Kirke, and the decree nisi was granted on October 27, 1936. In November, the king consulted with the British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, on a way to marry Wallis and keep the throne. The king suggested a morganatic marriage, where he would remain king but Wallis would not be queen, but this was rejected by Baldwin and the Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and the Union of South Africa. If the king were to marry Wallis against Baldwin's advice, the government would be required to resign, causing a constitutional crisis. Wallis's relationship with the king had become public knowledge in the United Kingdom by early December. She decided to flee the country as the scandal broke, and was driven to the south of France in a dramatic race to outrun the press. For the next 3 months, she was under siege by the media at the Villa VIII, near Caen, the home of her close friends Herman and Catherine Rogers, whom she later thanked effusively in her ghost-written memoirs. On her instructions, according to Andrew Morton, on the basis of an interview with Rogers's stepdaughter-in-law 80 years later, the ghostwriter made no mention of her confession that Herman Rogers was actually the love of her life. At her hideaway, Wallis was pressured by Lord Brownlow, the king's lord-in-waiting, to renounce the king. On December 7, 1936, Lord Brownlow read to the press her statement, which he had helped her draft, indicating Wallis's readiness to give up the king. However, Edward was determined to marry Wallis. John Theodore Goddard, Wallis's solicitor, stated, "Client was ready to do anything to ease the situation, but the other end of the wicket was determined." This seemingly indicated that the king had decided he had no option but to abdicate if he wished to marry Wallis. The king signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936, in the presence of his 3 surviving brothers, the Duke of York, the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent. Special laws passed by the parliaments of the Dominions finalised Edward's abdication the following day, or in Ireland's case 1 day later. On December 11, 1936, Edward said in a radio broadcast, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility, and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." Edward left Britain for Austria, where he stayed at Schloss Enzesfeld, the home of Baron Eugen and Baroness Kitty de Rothschild. Edward had to remain apart from Wallis until there was no danger of compromising the granting of a decree absolute in her divorce proceedings. Upon her divorce being made final in May 1937, she changed her name by deed poll to Wallis Warfield, resuming her maiden name. The couple were reunited at the Château de Cande, Mons, France, on May 4, 1937. Third marriage, Duchess of Windsor. Wallis and Edward married 1 month later on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Cande, lent to them by French millionaire Charles Bedos. The date would have been King George VI's 72nd birthday. Queen Mary thought the wedding had been scheduled for then as a deliberate slight. No member of Edward's family attended. Wallis wore a Wallis blue Mainbocher wedding dress. Edward presented her with an engagement ring that consisted of an emerald mount in yellow gold set with diamonds, and the sentence "We are ours now" was engraved on it. While the Church of England refused to sanction the wedding, Robert Anderson Jardine, vicar of St. Paul's, Darlington, offered to perform the service, an offer that was accepted by the couple. Guests included Randolph Churchill, Baron Eugene Daniel von Rothschild, and the best man, Major Fruity Metcalfe. The marriage produced no children. In November, Ernest Simpson married Mary Kirke. Edward was created Duke of Windsor by his brother King George VI prior to the marriage. However, letters patent, issued by the new king and unanimously supported by the Dominion governments, prevented Wallis, now the Duchess of Windsor, from sharing her husband's style of Royal Highness. George VI's firm view that the Duchess should not be given a royal title was shared by Queen Mary and George's wife, Queen Elizabeth. At first, the British royal family did not accept the Duchess and would not receive her formally, although the former king sometimes met his mother and siblings after his abdication. Some biographers have suggested that Wallis's sister-in-law Queen Elizabeth remained bitter towards her for her role in bringing George VI to the throne and for prematurely behaving as Edward's consort when she was his mistress. These claims were denied by Queen Elizabeth's close friends, such as the Duke of Grafton, who wrote that she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. Queen Elizabeth was said to have referred to Simpson as that woman, while the Duchess of Windsor referred to Queen Elizabeth as Mrs. Temple and Cookie, alluding to her solid figure and fondness for food, and to her daughter Princess Elizabeth as Shirley, as in Shirley Temple. The Duchess bitterly resented the denial of the royal title and the refusal of the Duke's relatives to accept her as part of the family. Within the household of the Duke and Duchess, the style Her Royal Highness was used by those who were close to the couple. According to the wife of former British Union of Fascists leader Oswald Mosley, Diana Mitford, who knew both Queen Elizabeth and the Duchess of Windsor but was only friendly with the latter, the Queen's antipathy toward her sister-in-law may have resulted from jealousy. Lady Mosley wrote to her sister, the Duchess of Devonshire, after the death of the Duke of Windsor, probably the theory of their contemporaries that Cake was rather in love with him and took second best, may account for much. The Duke and Duchess lived in France in the pre-war years. In 1937, they made a high-profile visit to Germany and met Adolf Hitler at the Burghof, his Berchtesgaden retreat. After the visit, Hitler said of Wallis, "She would have made a good queen." The visit tended to corroborate the strong suspicions of many in government and society that the Duchess was a German agent, a claim that she ridiculed in her letters to the Duke. U.S. FBI files compiled in the 1930s also portray her as a possible Nazi sympathizer. Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg told the FBI that she and leading Nazi Joachim von Ribbentrop had been lovers in London. There were even rather improbable reports during the Second World War that she kept a signed photograph of Ribbentrop on her bedside table. Second World War. As the German troops advanced, the Duke and Duchess fled south from their Paris home, first to Biarritz then to Spain in June. She told United States Ambassador to Spain Alexander W. Weddell that France had lost because it was internally diseased. The Duke and Duchess moved to Portugal in July. They stayed in Cascais, at Casa de Santa Maria, the home of Ricardo do Espírito Santo e Silva, a banker who was suspected of being a German agent. In August 1940, the Duke and Duchess traveled by commercial liner to the Bahamas where he was installed as governor. Wallis performed her role as the governor's consort competently for 5 years. She worked actively for the Red Cross and in the improvement of infant welfare. However, she hated Nassau, calling it our St. Helena in a reference to Napoleon's final place of exile. She was heavily criticized in the British press for her extravagant shopping in the United States, undertaken when Britain was enduring privations such as rationing and blackout. She referred to the local population as lazy, thriving niggers in letters to her aunt, which reflected her upbringing in Jim Crow Baltimore. Prime Minister Winston Churchill strenuously objected in 1941 when she and her husband planned to tour the Caribbean aboard a yacht belonging to Swedish magnate Axel Wenner-Gren, who Churchill said was pro-German, and Churchill complained again when the Duke gave a defeatist interview. Another of their acquaintances, Charles Beddoes, who had hosted their wedding, was arrested on charges of treason in 1943 but committed suicide in jail in Miami before the case was brought to trial. The British establishment distrusted the Duchess. Sir Alexander Hardinge wrote that her suspected anti-British activities were motivated by a desire for revenge against a country that rejected her as its queen. The couple returned to France in retirement after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Later life. In 1946, when the Duchess was staying at Ednam Lodge, the home of the Earl of Dudley, some of her jewels were stolen. There were rumors that the theft had been masterminded by the royal family as an attempt to regain jewels taken from the royal collection by the Duke, or by the Windsors themselves as part of an insurance fraud. They made a large deposit of loose stones at Cartier the following year. However, in 1960, career criminal Richard Dunphy confessed to the crime. The stolen pieces were only a small portion of the Windsor jewels, which were either bought privately, inherited by the Duke, or given to the Duke when he was Prince of Wales. In 1952 they were offered the use of a house by the Paris municipal authorities. The couple lived at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, near Neuilly-sur-Seine, for most of the remainder of their lives, essentially living a life of easy retirement. They traveled frequently between Europe and America aboard ocean liners. They bought a second house in the country, Moulin de la Tuilerie or the Mill in Gif-sur-Yvette, where they soon became close friends of their neighbors, Oswald and Diana Moseley. Years later, Diana Moseley claimed that the Duke and Duchess shared her and her husband's views that Hitler should have been given a free hand to destroy communism, as the Duke wrote in the New York Daily News of December 13, 1966. In a roundabout way encouraged me to infer that Red Russia was the only enemy and that it was in Britain's interest and in Europe's too, that Germany be encouraged to strike east and smash communism forever. I confess frankly that he took me in. I thought the rest of us could be fence-sitters while the Nazis and the Reds slogged it out. In 1965, the Duke and Duchess visited London as the Duke required eye surgery for a detached retina. Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent, visited them. The Duke's sister, the Princess Royal, also visited just 10 days before her death. They attended her memorial service in Westminster Abbey. Later, in 1967, the Duke and Duchess joined the royal family in London for the unveiling of a plaque by Elizabeth II to commemorate the centenary of Queen Mary's birth. Wallis and Edward spoke to Kenneth Harris for an extensive BBC television interview in 1970. Both Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles visited the Windsors in Paris in the Duke's later years, the Queen's visit coming only shortly before the Duke died. Widowhood. Upon the Duke's death from throat cancer in 1972, the Duchess travelled to the United Kingdom to attend his funeral, staying at Buckingham Palace during her visit. The Duchess became increasingly frail and eventually succumbed to dementia, living the final years of her life as a recluse, supported by both her husband's estate and an allowance from the Queen. She suffered several falls and broke her hip twice. After Edward's death, the Duchess's French lawyer, Suzanne Bloom, assumed power of attorney. Bloom sold items belonging to the Duchess to her own friends at lower than market value and was accused of exploiting her client in Caroline Blackwood's The Last of the Duchess, written in 1980 but not published until 1995, after Bloom's death. Later, royal biographer Hugo Vickers called Bloom a satanic figure, wearing the mantle of good intention to disguise her inner malevolence. In 1980, the Duchess lost her ability to speak. Towards the end, she was bedridden and did not receive any visitors, apart from her doctor and nurses. Death. The Duchess of Windsor died on April 24, 1986, at her home in the Bois de Boulogne, Paris, at the age of 89. Her funeral was held on April 29 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, attended by her 2 surviving sisters-in-law, the Queen Mother and Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, and other members of the royal family. The Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Prince and Princess of Wales attended both the funeral ceremony and the burial. Diana said afterwards that it was the only time she had seen the Queen weep. She was buried next to Edward in the royal burial ground near Windsor Castle, as Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. Prior to an agreement with Queen Elizabeth II in the 1960s, the Duke and Duchess had previously planned for a burial in a purchased cemetery plot at Green Mount Cemetery in Baltimore, where the Duchess's father was interred. In recognition of the help France gave to the Duke and Duchess in providing them with a home, and in lieu of death duties, the Duchess's collection of Louis XVI-style furniture, some porcelain, and paintings were made over to the French state. The British royal family received no major bequests. Most of her estate went to the Pasteur Institute Medical Research Foundation, on the instructions of Suzanne Bloom. The decision took the royal family and the Duchess's friends by surprise, as she had shown little interest in charity during her life. In a Sotheby's auction in Geneva, in April 1987, the Duchess's remarkable jewelry collection raised $45 million for the Institute, approximately 7 times its pre-sale estimate. Bloom later claimed that Egyptian entrepreneur Mohammed Al-Fayed tried to purchase the jewels for a rock-bottom price. Al-Fayed bought much of the non-financial estate, including the lease of the Paris mansion. An auction of his collection was announced in July 1997 for later that year in New York. Delayed by his son's death in the car crash that also claimed the life of Diana, Princess of Wales, the sale raised more than £14 million for charity in 1998. Legacy. Wallis was plagued by rumors of other lovers. The gay American Jimmy Donahue, an heir to the Woolworth fortune, claimed to have had a liaison with her in the 1950s, but Donahue was notorious for his inventive pranks and rumor-mongering. Wallis's memoir The Heart Has Its Reasons was published in 1956, and biographer Charles Hyam said that facts were remorselessly rearranged in what amounted to a self-performed facelift. He describes the Duchess as charismatic, electric, and compulsively ambitious. Fictional depictions of the Duchess include the novel Famous Last Words by Canadian author Timothy Findlay, which portrays her as a manipulative conspirator, and Rose Tremine's short story The Darkness of Wallis Simpson, which depicts her more sympathetically in her final years of ill health. Hearsay and conjecture have clouded assessment of the Duchess of Windsor's life, not helped by her own manipulation of the truth. But, in the opinion of her biographers, there is no document which proves directly that she was anything other than a victim of her own ambition, who lived out a great romance that became a great tragedy. In the words of one, she experienced the ultimate fairy tale, becoming the adored favorite of the most glamorous bachelor of his time. The idol went wrong when, ignoring her pleas, he threw up his position to spend the rest of his life with her. The Duchess herself is reported to have summed up her life in a sentence: "You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance." Titles and styles. June 19, 1896 – November 8, 1916, Miss Bessie Wallis Warfield. November 8, 1916 – July 21, 1928, Mrs. Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. July 21, 1928 – May 7, 1937, Mrs. Ernest Aldrich Simpson. May 7, 1937 – June 3, 1937, Mrs. Wallis Warfield. Wallis resumed her maiden surname by deed poll on May 7, 1937, but continued to use the title Mrs. June 3, 1937 – April 24, 1986, Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor. The Duchess of Windsor was unofficially styled Her Royal Highness within her own household.